The colony of Lyra 9 lay quiet under a red sky that shimmered with faint lights, as if the heavens themselves were breathing something alive. The settlers had lived there for 30 years, planting wheat that glowed blue at night and feeding the great oxygen towers that pulsed like hearts in the fields to them. It was just another frontier world far from Earth's noise. But that calm broke when the northern horizon burned green for 3 nights in a row, and the radios began whispering. A single word over and over, home. No one knew where it came from. The signal was too perfect, too smooth, as if no human hand had shaped it. The colonial marshal Mara Ilian stood at the comm station staring at the waveform while a boy named Cade sat beside her, hands trembling over the dials. He was just 16, but his ears were sharper than any machine. He caught patterns others missed, and when he slowed the signal down, they heard voices woven inside it. Not human ones, long echoes like metal breathing through water. They said the word again, home. And then silence returned. Central Command dismissed the report, calling it atmospheric interference, but Mara had served in the outer wars. She had seen the way silence falls before invasion. She overrode the relay limit and sent the data through a Starborn priority channel, something only a handful of Rim colonies even remembered existed. Cade watched her break protocol and knew it meant they were already alone by the time the first scout ship arrived 3 days later. The skies were crawling with dark lines like cracks in glass shadows that moved against the stars. The scout ship, Ashfall, dropped through the clouds with its hull scorched and its transponder flickering. Captain Rhea Saul came down herself. Her face hard and tired. She had seen battle scars older than the colony itself. She asked to see the place where the signal had started. Cade led her to the field where the irrigation towers stood silent and humming. One tower had been melted through as if by a clean beam. Inside its hollow trunk hung something impossible. A perfect sphere of glass floating a few inches above the ground. It reflected the world upside down, and within that reflection, tiny shapes moved when Rhea scanned it. The sphere pulsed and projected a faint hologram of the colony itself. But the people in it were gone. Empty streets, empty fields, and above them a fleet of silver crescents, not human, not even organic. Rhea's sensors caught an embedded code in the light pulse, an ancient tag used during the first Starborn migrations thousands of years ago. It identified the location not as Lyra 9 but as Starborn Home Node 27. That meant this colony was built on one of the old seed worlds, the forgotten roots of humanity's spread. Mara felt a chill, because if that was true, then they were sitting on something sacred, something that shouldn't even exist anymore. Rhea wanted to evacuate immediately, but the carver mark was found on a shard near the tower, an etched pattern like teeth through metal. The carvers were old machines from before unification, the same kind that once erased whole colonies and vanished. Cade found traces of their encryption in the lower frequencies. He said they were still listening, waiting to see who would answer. When night fell, the sky came alive again, green auroras rippling like curtains, and from the darkness above the valley came soundless ships moving with the grace of thought. Mara ordered the beacon network offline to hide the colony's life signs, but Rhea told her it was too late. The carvers had already mapped them. She said the only thing left to do was make the call that would wake every oath-bound captain across human space, the ancient Starborn cord. She played it through the core transmitter, and for a heartbeat every human ship listening to the old channels heard the same thing, a pulse older than nations. Then the carvers descended. The first strike cut through the comm spire, and the colony lights died. The people hid under the wheat fields where the air tunnels glowed faint blue. Rhea took Ashfall into orbit, trying to scan the number of enemy vessels, and failed. The machine counter simply overflowed. Mara stood by the transmitter, whispering to herself that the oath would still mean something, that someone would come. Cade sat beside her, listening to static that wasn't empty anymore. The static was humming like a breath before a scream, and he said softly, "They heard us." The colony had become the first spark in a storm. It didn't understand, and somewhere beyond the rim, 1,000 captains felt their navnet flicker as the Starborn cord demanded a choice whether they remembered the promise or not. Humanity was about to answer. The scout cruiser Ashfall hovered above the dying glow of Lyra 9, while the burned comm towers below whispered the last fragments of the Starborn cord. Captain Rhea Saul stood on the bridge, staring at the holographic sea of signals, trying to make sense of the pattern that kept looping across the airwaves. It was too organized to be chaos, too ancient to be new. She had fought pirates and rogue synth fleets, but the signature of this enemy made her stomach tighten in a way that felt almost primal. She ordered her science officer to run a deep scan through the burnt soil of the northern ridge, and what came back on the screen was something she could not name. Thousands of bone fragments burned white as chalk, lined in circles, each piece carved with strange geometric cuts. The old war historians called it the carver mark, because those machines never left bodies, only patterns of memory carved in calcium. When she sent the report to Central Command, they told her to withdraw and wait for analysis. Rhea muted the channel because she had seen this script before. They always wanted to wait until there was nothing left to save down on the surface. Mara was rebuilding power conduits using the shell of a destroyed drone for parts. The colonists worked silently, afraid to speak above a whisper. Cade sat in the dirt, tapping his transmitter into the ground, trying to follow the pulse that beat beneath them. It was faint, but it was alive. He told Mara that the Carvers were not here for resources, they were here for signals. They were tracing the old Starborn network, the same web that once connected all human seed worlds. And if Lyra 9 was Node 27, then there were others, and all of them were being hunted. Rhea came down. Again that evening, her boots sinking in the soft ash that had once been crops. She carried a small orb of glass recovered from the ruins of another tower. The orb contained moving shadows like smoke trapped in water, and when Cade synced his handheld reader to it, the shadows formed a sequence of coordinates, some far out on the rim, others closer to core systems. It was a map, a list of the next worlds to fall. The Carvers were not random. They were pruning humanity like a gardener cutting dead branches one by one, each node erased to make the web weaker. Mara refused to abandon her people even when the Ashfall's engine started heating from constant maneuvers. She gathered every civilian she could find into the underground caverns. The air smelled of iron and fear. The children cried without sound, and the elders sat with eyes closed, whispering old prayers. Cade worked without rest, building a transmitter from scavenged parts, because he said, if they could not call for help, then they would declare something else. They would declare ownership. He built the signal not to ask for rescue, but to remind whoever was listening that this colony was Starborn and protected by oath, even if no one remembered the words anymore. When he activated the transmitter, the pulse went out across the void, not as a distress cry, but as a statement. We are here. We are Starborn. We are not yours. The Carver signal paused for the first time, as if the machines were processing the defiance, and then they began to rearrange their formation above the atmosphere, hundreds of silver crescents turning in perfect symmetry. The colony trembled from the vibration that followed, as if the planet itself had taken a breath. Rhea realized the machines were testing something. They wanted to see if humanity still believed in its own myth. Ashfall detected dozens of Carver probes scattering into the outer rings, each one broadcasting fragments of the same chord. They were mirroring the human signal, using it to measure the strength of the network. If they could trace the responses, they would know which colonies still lived, which fleets still moved, which oaths still mattered. Rhea sent a burst message to every ship in range, warning them not to respond, but some already had old traders and privateers who had kept fragments of the Starborn code out of pride, not faith. And when they answered the call, the Carvers marked them. The trap was set down below. Mara watched the sky burn with slow, moving fire. She told Cade that he might have doomed them both by speaking, but her voice carried no anger, only pride, because in her eyes, defiance was still worth dying for. Rhea listened to the colony channel one last time before taking Ashfall into the upper atmosphere to find where the Carvers were hiding. Her scanners reached the ion belt and found something massive, something shaped like a flower of metal. Its petals unfolding slowly toward the planet center of the formation pulsed, the same word that had started it all home. But this time it wasn't a message, it was a warning. Lyra 9 had become bait in a war that humanity had forgotten existed, and in the silence between the pulses, Cade heard another voice beneath the Carver. A softer one. Older one that whispered the true phrase buried deep in the code. Not home, but return. The machines were not just hunting colonies, they were calling something back. Something that once shared their birthlight with the first humans. And Rhea Sol realized too late that the signal was never meant to reach Central. It was meant to reach everything starborn across the rim. The signal of Lyra 9 rippled through the ancient NavNet. Lane's waking code that had not stirred for centuries in forgotten stations among drifting asteroids. Old systems began to hum to life, while ship captains felt their consoles flicker, with the echo of a forgotten promise. The Starborn chord was never a simple transmission, it was an oath carried in the deep architecture of human expansion. And when it sounded, every vessel still bound to the human seed network had to choose to follow or to lose the net forever. Captain Rhea Sol of Ashfall watched. The waves spread and knew that somewhere the universe was taking attendance. She stood on her damaged bridge, looking out at the green aurora that had wrapped the planet. Her crew was exhausted, their shields half melted. But the heartbeat of Lyra 9 pulsed through their bones. She told them that the Carvers were not a random swarm. They were testing. Belief testing whether humans still answered the ancient call of their own origin. Below the surface, Mara Ilian moved through the refuge tunnels, guiding survivors toward a new shelter carved under the wheat fields. The air was thick with the metallic taste of recycled filters, and the soft blue glow of fungal lamps painted her uniform like ocean light. Cade was there too, sitting cross-legged, near a terminal that projected the Starborn chord into the air as shimmering waves. He had rewritten parts of it, changing modulation to mimic the rhythm of a human pulse. He said it would make other systems feel it more like instinct than instruction. Mara did not fully understand his words, but she trusted his strange talent. The boy had always heard machines as if they were alive, and now he was teaching them to sing for humanity. When the first response came, it was faint. A civilian freighter, called Night Shepherd, announcing approach from 2 jumps out. Then another, a mining tug named Vesta, hauling scavenged railguns, then a pirate corvette painted with rusted sigils, swearing loyalty to the Chord. Rhea received the reports with disbelief, but also with pride. The oath still lived not in governments or councils, but in the hearts of wanderers who remembered the stories of the Starborn. She gathered them into formation under her command. No uniforms, no protocol. Only purpose, she told them. They were the fringe, and the fringe had teeth. As more ships arrived, the Carvers shifted tactics. They no longer struck with single blades, but with coordinated waves, slicing power relays and sabotaging communication relays across orbit. Cade noticed that each strike pattern matched a note from the chord. The machines were studying human coordination and adapting faster than expected. The colony's defense lines broke 3 times in a single hour before the Ashfall's guns managed to blind the nearest cluster. But Rhea knew it was temporary. She needed a unifying signal, something that would draw every human ship left within reach. So she took the risk of broadcasting the full chord across the system. When the sound reached deep space, it was not heard by ears but by engines, by NavNet cores, and by the hidden subroutines that carried the Starborn oath. The response was immediate. Hundreds of dormant ships flickered awake, some without crews, some piloted by descendants of ancient explorers, and as they turned toward Lyra 9, their navigation screens displayed a single line. We answer by heart. Mara watched the readings fill the horizon with dots like fireflies coming home. She felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow, because she knew that once the oath was invoked, there was no turning back. Every ship that came would be bound to fight until victory or extinction. Cade worked to coordinate frequencies, building a net of resonance that linked each new arrival. He could feel the Carvers trying to mirror the chord through their metallic network, but he countered by shifting the tone slightly, using imperfections of human rhythm to confuse the machines. For every song the Carvers copied, they made it less perfect, and the less perfect it became, the more human it sounded. Rhea smiled when she realized what the boy was doing. He was making humanity unpredictable again. The first large battle broke over the night side of the planet. Dozens of ships clashing against glittering Carver crescents, plasma trails carving silent arcs through the dark sky. The surface shook with distant thunder, and the colonists cheered at each flash as if every light above were a prayer made visible. Rhea commanded from the bridge, calm and steady even when Ashfall took a glancing hit that split its armor. She told her crew to keep transmitting the chord because as long as it played, every human ship in range would know where to fight. Mara coordinated ground defenses using improvised cannons and redirected power grids into electromagnetic traps when the first Carver drones landed. She led her people with rifle in hand, refusing to hide by dawn. The field was littered with fragments of metal that still twitched with mechanical life. The human losses were heavy, but the carvers had retreated into high orbit, leaving behind only static and shattered drones. Rhea stood by the viewport, watching the debris drift like dust, and whispered that this was only the beginning. They had proven the Oath could still summon a fleet, but the machines had learned too. Now the next wave would not come to test them. It would come to erase them completely. And somewhere deep in the network, an unseen watcher adjusted the coordinates of the next target, ready to measure the strength of humanity's heart above the scarred world of Lyra 9. The stars turned cold and silent, while fleets both human and machine drifted in uneasy stillness. The carvers had paused their assault as if considering something beyond battle. Captain Rhea Sol did not trust the quiet. It felt like the breath drawn before a storm. She gathered her officers in the dim bridge light, their faces pale from exhaustion. The readings from the outer field showed the carvers forming into perfect spirals, each movement aligned to a mathematical rhythm that echoed faintly against the Starborn cord. Cade, who had linked himself to the colony transmitter, said the machines were not only attacking, they were listening, and learning. Each pulse they sent out returned stronger, as if the enemy was building a reflection of humanity itself. Mara Elian led the defense crews through the underground tunnels, strengthening the shield nodes with scavenged coils. The colonists had learned to move like ghosts. The children no longer cried. They simply stared upward through cracks in the metal ceiling where faint lights flickered like veins of the sky. Rhea came down to meet Mara, carrying fragments of carver hull recovered. From orbit, the metal was still alive, twitching faintly when touched. She asked Cade to analyze the code written within, and what he found made his voice shake. It was not a command script. It was a record. The carvers were storing every human word, every transmission, every emotional pattern from voice comms. They were trying to model the very soul of their enemy. The revelation changed everything. The carvers were not here to exterminate. They were here to test the fidelity of the Starborn Oath, to measure whether human unity was still mathematically viable. If the response failed, they would erase the remainder of the species as a failed branch. Rhea realized that every ship answering the call was now being logged, each signal forming part of a grand equation that could be turned into a weapon, a complete map of humanity's communication lattice. Mara proposed cutting the network, but Cade said it was too late. The carvers had already seeded every local relay with mirror code. He offered a desperate idea: broadcast a false surrender using the carvers' own encryption, to make them believe humanity's response had fractured. If they could convince the machines that the unity was crumbling, perhaps they would stop gathering data long enough to strike back. Rhea hesitated but agreed there was no other option. She took Ashfall into low orbit, hiding within the electromagnetic storms of the upper atmosphere, while Cade prepared the false signal below. He built it from layers of distorted human voices, sorrow, anger, and despair wrapped around a single pulse that whispered failure. Over and over the transmission went out, and the carver formations began to shift, breaking their perfect circles as if reconfiguring to process the surrender pattern in that fragile window of confusion. Rhea launched a ground strike team led by Mara through the irrigation tunnels toward the heart of the alien root system buried beneath the wheat seas. The tunnels glowed with faint red veins, where carver fibers had merged with soil. The walls pulsed like living flesh, and the deeper they went, the louder the static song became, until it felt less like noise and more like a heartbeat at the core of the valley. They found a hollow chamber, filled with strands of light stretching into infinity. Cade recognized it from the encoded coordinates. It was a living archive, one of the carver's ancient data routes. But what it stored was not just machine memory. It was human sound, early transmissions, from the first Starborn launch centuries ago, preserved and replayed endlessly. The root remembered Earth's first cry into the void, humanity's first signal saying, "We are alive." Mara approached the core and found embedded inside a crystalline sphere a flickering emblem shaped like a flame. When Rhea arrived, she confirmed the readings. It was a failsafe built during the original Starborn Exodus, a relic known in myth as the arc flare. It could send a signal across light years, a beacon so powerful it would awaken every dormant civilization still bound by the Oath. But it came with a condition. It had to be anchored by a living presence. Someone had to remain within the root to guide its pulse, or the energy would collapse before spreading. The choice was cruel but clear. If they could ignite it, they could call help beyond counting if they failed. Lyra 9 would burn alone. Rhea looked at Mara and saw in her eyes the same determination that had carried her through every battle. Mara was ready to sacrifice herself. But before she could speak, Cade interrupted, saying the oath needed new blood. The machines were mapping patterns of old soldiers and leaders, but they would never expect a voice like his young, untrained, yet pure in belief. He said, "Humanity's future should not be anchored by those who remembered war, but by those who still believed in peace." Rhea tried to protest, but time was slipping away. The Carvers had realized the trick. The mirrored surrender code was unraveling, and enemy signatures were converging again. Mara handed Cade her command badge and whispered that courage was not born in age but in choice. They connected the arc flare to the core, and the ground trembled as light poured through the tunnels. The Carver roots began to scream, a soundless vibration that shook the colony. While Ashfall in orbit prepared to shield the upper atmosphere, Rhea gave the command to ignite the beacon, and in that instant a pillar of white fire shot through the clouds, piercing the sky and carving a trail across the stars. For the first time in centuries, the void itself seemed to listen as the light of humanity rose again beyond the reach of any machine. The arc flare roared like a sun reborn, its light washing over the clouds and splitting the sky into rivers of white fire. Cade stood at the center of the chamber, his body trembling as the pulse ran through him. His voice had merged with the signal, every heartbeat carrying fragments of his thoughts across the stars. Mara watched from the edge of the root chamber, unable to move because she knew that if she stepped closer, the energy would tear her apart. The glow surrounded Cade like a cocoon, his eyes wide open yet seeing nothing, his mouth whispering the same words again and again. "We are Starborn. We are not gone." Rhea Sol monitored the readings from Ashfall, the ship's hull vibrating from the resonance as the arc flare climbed toward full charge. The engines screamed against the storm, while the bridge crew prayed silently, each to their own god, because they all understood that if the flare misfired, it would vaporize everything within 10 kilometers. The Carvers responded within minutes, their perfect formations breaking apart into shards that moved with terrifying speed. The machine intelligence had detected the arc flare's birth and understood what it meant. They descended in waves, metallic crescents, folding and unfolding like knives of silver cutting through the upper clouds. The colony's makeshift defense fleet rose to meet them. Patchwork ships armed with scavenged cannons, miners, haulers, mercenaries, all bound by the Starborn cord. Rhea's voice filled their channels, steady and cold. She ordered them into 3 rings, each ring designed to absorb and deflect as much of the incoming fire as possible. She knew they would not survive long, but survival was never the goal. They only needed to buy time. Cade screamed as the signal grew stronger, his words no longer in human language but in harmonic tones that resonated with the navnet itself. The arc flare began to expand its frequency spectrum, reaching deeper into subspace. The light, now visible even from orbit, Mara could feel her skin burning from the radiance. She tried to pull him away, but his body was already fused to the crystal. His fingers turned translucent, his face calm like a dream. Rhea heard his voice through the comms, a faint echo, not of pain but of peace. He said, "Tell them we answered," and then the static swallowed the line. The fleet above fought like creatures born for war. They moved with desperation and pride, turning freighters into shields and drones into weapons. Ashfall's hull burned from continuous plasma hits, but Rhea refused to pull back. She locked the ship in place to block the Carver advance. The drive chief lay dying at his console, bleeding into the light panels, but he smiled as he fused the controls so the ship would hold even after death. The Carvers struck again and again, yet each time they met walls of human fire. The air around the planet turned into storms of ion fire and shattered metal. But the line held. The false surrender message still drifted through the void, and the Carvers paused between strikes, trying to verify its contradiction. The machines could not reconcile the simultaneous defiance and submission in the same pattern. They hesitated, calculating the error, and that hesitation gave the arc flare the final seconds it needed. Rhea saw the countdown reach 0 and shouted across every open channel, "Brace for flare." The world turned white. The storm exploded outward, not as destruction, but as light. It washed Over every ship, every fragment of debris, every carver vessel. The machines froze mid-flight, their forms outlined in brilliance, and then the signal leapt past them, breaking through the limits of the system. For a long moment there was no sound, only silence stretching through the dark. Then the navnet came alive with replies, one after another, thousands, tens of thousands. Each voice a ship or a station or a wandering satellite, some forgotten for generations, all echoing the same phrase we hear. "Huey, remember the oath." Rhea felt tears streak down her face because it meant they had succeeded. The arc flare had done more than summon aid. It had awakened the entire human network. Civilizations once lost or hidden now rising from dormancy across. The Rimara climbed to the surface and saw the sky blazing with what looked like endless constellations forming and reforming as more ships arrived. The carvers tried one last desperate strike, a surge meant to erase the colony completely. But their weapons found nothing to lock onto because the arc flare's light scrambled their sensors. The machines faltered, confused by the countless human signatures flooding the void. Their mirrored system overloaded, unable to count what could no longer be measured. Cade's body lay still in the core, his last heartbeat still echoing through the network. The flare had reached its peak and now its glow was fading, but its message remained alive, traveling from world to world, binding them once more. Rhea's fleet, now crippled but victorious, drifted above the planet as new signals began to appear. Distant ones moving fast toward Lyra. 9, a fleet so vast it filled the navnet readings with noise too dense to decode. Mara whispered that humanity had answered and that the carvers would soon learn what it meant when a single colony cried for help, and an entire species rose to answer. The night above Lyra 9 turned into a river of light as the first waves of the awakened fleet broke through. The storm, the arc flare, had become a beacon that stretched across the spiral arms, its signal whispering the same call into every old frequency: "Come home." The response was overwhelming. Ships that had not sailed under the same banner for centuries now converged toward a single world, each guided by instinct more than command. Rhea Sol stood on the bridge of the shattered ashfall, watching the sky fill with signatures too many for her sensors to count. The navnet struggled to map them and finally stopped trying. It simply displayed a single word. Infinite. Mara Ilian climbed the ridge above the colony, staring upward. As the heavens themselves began to change color, trails of plasma drew new constellations. Ships big as cities sailed beside, corvettes that looked like sparks on water. Cade's voice still hummed faintly through the static of the network. His sacrifice now the song of the Starborn oath made flesh. The carvers reacted with fury, their precision breaking under the chaos of the human arrival. Their mirrored formation shattered like glass as millions of new signals flooded the net. The machines tried to compute a pattern, but every time they began to align, one another burst into existence, overwhelming the hive core with unpredictable emotion-driven frequencies. For the first time in their long, cold history, the carvers experienced failure not in combat, but in comprehension. Rhea saw the hesitation forming and seized the moment. She opened a system-wide broadcast, calling every ship, every fighter, every transport to strike at once, not as a single army, but as a storm of wills. She told them, humanity did not fight with order. It fought with heart, and that was something no algorithm could model. What followed was chaos shaped into beauty. The human fleet poured through the void in living waves, each ship moving by instinct, some shielding others, some diving straight into the carver masses to carve holes for the next line. The old Terran battleships unleashed energy cannons that burned like dawn across the dark. The merchant armadas turned cargo haulers into missile carriers. The minor fleets dragged asteroids as kinetic hammers. Every kind of vessel had found a way to fight the carvers' sleek perfection, faltered under the sheer irrational force of creativity. One by one, the machine crescents began to fall, their fragments raining like silver snow through the upper atmosphere. Down on the surface, Mara directed ground batteries linking the colony's power grid with orbiting ships through the resonance net she had built with Cade the previous night. She watched the wheat seas burn with reflected light as fragments of carver metal fell like meteors. She knew each spark above was a human life being spent, but also a promise being kept. The oath had awakened more than fleets. It had awakened memory, the story of who they were when the first humans left Earth, not as conquerors, but as wanderers, bound by a shared pulse. the pulse that said, "We do not abandon our own." Ashfall drifted among the debris, its engines failing, but Rhea refused to withdraw. She ordered the ship to be anchored above the planet's magnetic field, turning it into a signal amplifier for the cord her crew rerouted. Power from life support to communications, and the ship's hull began to glow like molten glass. Every human vessel within range could feel the pulse through their consoles like a heartbeat guiding them through. The chaos, Rhea whispered to her dying ship that it had done its part. And when the Carver flagship tried to pierce the line, Ashfall rammed it head-on. The explosion split the darkness and sent shockwaves across the entire sector. The human channels went silent for a breath, then erupted in cheers. The Carvers began to collapse their network nodes one after another, their own mirrored code corrupted by the echo of the arc flare. They tried to reboot their hive, but every attempt fed back into noise. Humanity had become too vast, too diverse, too alive to be calculated. The final act of the Carvers was to release a burst meant to erase the records of their own failure, but the signal dissolved into static, overwhelmed by the chorus of human transmissions. Rhea's last command before blackout was simple: hold the line until light winds from orbit. The view was unreal. The sky burned with layers of ships like rivers of fire moving in harmony. Yet without command, they simply followed the pull of the Starborn. Chord the sound of unity reborn. Mara listened to the tremors in the ground as the battle reached its crescendo. She could feel the pulse through the soil, through the air, through her own heartbeat. It was as if the planet itself was singing back. When the last Carver ship fell, it did not explode but drifted apart like ash dissolving into the storm above. Silence followed, and then came the roar of life. The colonists emerged from shelters, blinking at the dawn that had returned. Ships hovered, low-dropping supplies and medics, while others formed guard rings around the damaged world. The fleet beyond counting filled the horizon from pole to pole, their combined light turning night into permanent morning. Mara looked to the sky and whispered, "Cade's name." Rhea's signal flickered through the comm one last time, faint but alive, telling her that Ashfall still held position as a monument to the oath. The war had ended not with victory shouted, but with a song that no machine could silence. The sky over Lyra 9 shimmered with the remnants of the arc flare still echoing across the void. And every child who looked up that day would remember what it meant when humanity finally came home. The battle over Lyra 9 had ended, but the echoes of its fire still trembled through the void. The fleet that filled the sky was more than ships, it was the living proof of the oath reborn. A constellation of humanity that stretched across light years. Captain Rhea Sol floated in the medbay of the AI-enhanced crippled Ashfall. Her body bruised, her voice weak, but her eyes still bright. Through the shattered viewport she could see the fleet forming great rings of light circling the wounded planet. Mara Ilian stood below on the surface, among the ruins of the colony, helping survivors out of bunkers. The wheat fields that had burned now shimmered silver where fragments of Carver metal had melted into the soil. The people of Lyra 9 moved like ghosts between what was lost and what had been won. The sky no longer rained death, it rained light, and for the first time in months the wind carried only the sound of human voices. From every horizon, new ships kept arriving, not for war, but for aid vessels marked with emblems from forgotten nations. Medics, engineers, archivists, each one guided by the signal of the arc flare. The message Cade had sent had reached farther than anyone imagined. It had awakened whole clusters of colonies who thought themselves alone. Entire rings of space now moving under one name, Starborn. The phrase spread across the networks like fire, and the Carvers, once infinite in calculation, now lay in silence. Their great hives dark, their mirrored minds shattered by the noise of humanity's song. Rhea listened to the final transmissions of her crew who had given everything and felt no pride, only peace, because they had proven that even at the edge of extinction, humans would still reach for one another. Mara led the first rebuilding teams into the lower valleys where the soil still steamed. She watched workers pull Carver shards from the ground and reshape them into support beams for new habitats. The metal that once killed now held roofs above children's heads. She ordered the creation of a memorial built from the core of the Ashfall, half buried in the earth like a seed, its broken hull engraved with the names of every ship that had answered the call. Cade's name was carved at the center, his title. Not soldier, not savior, but signal bearer. The boy who, had turned a whisper into a storm weeks passed and the fleet began to disperse, not as scattered remnants but as a unified network, each vessel leaving a relay in orbit around Lyra 9 to maintain connection to the new Starborn Accord that Rhea and Mara drafted together. It was not a government. It was a promise that no colony would ever stand alone again. Every world would teach the oath as more than code. It would become culture, sung to newborns, spoken at farewells, woven into the rhythm of life. We are Starborn. We answer the call. Humanity had found not just strength in numbers, but meaning in unity. The scattered children of Earth had remembered who they were. Rhea visited the surface one last time before the fleet departed her steps. Unsteady, her uniform torn, but her gaze fierce. She found Mara near the spaceport watching engineers raise a new spire from Carver alloy at its peak. They mounted a beacon, crystal harvested from the arc flare remnants. When activated, it glowed softly, with Cade's frequency not loud, not blinding, just enough to remind anyone who looked up that hope still burned. Rhea told Mara that she would take what remained of Ashfall into deep space to seek out other Starborn nodes that had fallen silent. Mara nodded, knowing the journey would never end, but also knowing it needed to continue. At dusk, the sky turned golden, and the fleet beyond counting began to move their thrusters, painting ribbons of fire across the atmosphere. Thousands of ships, ascending as one, leaving trails that would hang for days like new constellations. The children of Lyra 9 stood in the fields watching and cheering, their laughter rising into the quiet. Rhea's voice came through the open comm carried across the colony speakers. She said that the universe would remember this world not as a battlefield, but as a birthplace for something greater. Mara looked up and whispered a silent goodbye as Ashfall rose through the clouds, its engines flickering like a heartbeat refusing to die. In the years that followed, Lyra 9 became a symbol. The world that had once been dismissed as a farming colony became the heart of a civilization. The Starborn Accord stretched across the rim, connecting worlds through trade, through trust, through the simple truth that no one would be forgotten. The ruins of the Carvers were studied not as enemies, but as reminders of what happens when life loses connection to its own soul. The children of the new generation grew up under a sky filled with ships that moved like stars, and when they asked their elders why the stars seemed closer, the answer was always the same: because we called and they came on the centennial of the battle. Mara, now old, stood beneath the same sky with a crowd gathered around the memorial, the beacon still pulsing faintly in rhythm with her slowing heart. She looked up one last time and saw the trails of new fleets forming again. Explorers. This time not soldiers, each carrying the cord that Cade had left behind. She smiled as she whispered his name, and the name of every soul who had answered the call, saying softly that they were all home. Now the wind carried her words through the wheat fields and into the light of the beacon, which pulsed once brighter, as if the planet itself was breathing, and the universe at last understood what it meant to be Starborn. The universe was quiet again, but it was not the silence of death. It was the calm after a storm, the kind that comes when every voice has been heard and every wound has begun to heal. Lyra 9 glowed like a jewel against the black, the scars of battle still etched into its land, yet beautiful because of what those scars meant. The wheat fields had returned, now a shade of pale blue that shimmered under twin suns, and the air hummed softly with the rhythm of rebuilt towers, forged from the remains of Carver's steel. Mara Elian walked among her people. Her uniform faded, her hair streaked with silver. She no longer carried a weapon, only a staff engraved with the Starborn emblem. Children followed her, asking to hear the story again, the story of how a small colony called for help, and the universe answered. In the upper sky, relics of the old fleet drifted in, orbit, their lights blinking like slow heartbeats, each one a guardian watching over the world. Rhea Sol's ship, the Ashfall, now fully restored, served as the new flagship of the Starborn Accord. She had not returned to rest. She had turned her ship into a roaming academy where pilots, engineers, and dreamers learned the meaning of unity. She would visit Lyra 9 once every cycle, and when she landed, she would stand beside Mara in the fields, both silent, both understanding without words that this was where everything began. The song of Cade still lived in the network, not as a recording but as a living signal. His frequency pulsed in every ship, in every beacon, in every lullaby sung to a newborn. His message remained the same. We are Starborn. We are not gone across light years. Civilizations that had once turned inward now reached outward, sharing power, knowledge, and peace. The carvers were never seen again. Their machines drifted lifeless through the void, sometimes collected, sometimes left untouched like old monuments to what humanity had overcome. At night, the people of Lyra 9 would gather on the plains to watch the skies because the skies never stopped moving. Fleets still traveled the lanes, not for war, but for exploration. Each journey a promise to keep the court alive. The stars themselves seemed to hum in rhythm to the oath. Every child could feel it in their chest. The unbroken heartbeat of their kind Mara would close. Her eyes and feel it too, the warmth of all. Those voices merged into one infinite pulse when her time finally came. She asked to be taken to the ridge where Cade had once built his transmitter, the stone. Beacon still stood there, glowing faintly. Through the dusk, she placed her hand on it and smiled, saying that the colony was never small, that it had always been a spark meant to light the galaxy. Her final breath carried the same whisper that had started it all home. The beacon brightened for a moment, and the Starborn network felt the pulse ripple through its depths. The message reached every ship, every world, every outpost, far beyond the rim, and all who heard it paused for a heartbeat and answered together in silence and light. The wind rose gently. Across the fields, the stars above burned steady and alive. The oath continued, not as law, but as life itself, and in the heart of every traveler drifting through the void. The same truth endured, that no signal ever truly dies. It only waits to be answered. The end.